And at the end of the day, I mean, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, that is the curriculum. I mean, we offer classes in grammar, we teach traditional logic, and we teach rhetoric. So we have entire classes that are dedicated to these skills.
Hey, I'm Shane, and this is my guest, Mitchell Holley.
It's good to be here.
Mitch and I, on our last episode, we talked about moral philosophy, and we had such a great time. And one of the things he said is that he was so captivated when he came to Memoria Press by the education that he learned about liberal arts, and it triggered a thought for me, something I've been thinking about. And that is, I think it'd be really helpful to spend a few weeks talking about the basics of classical education, specifically the liberal arts. That was an idea I had and felt like going into the summer, we could have one guest on who knows his stuff, and we could talk about the liberal arts every week. And so I brought on my friend and guest, Mitchell Holley. So Mitch, remind me what you do with Memoria Press Online Academy, as I know that your knowledge of the liberal arts has brought a dynamic to that work that is really helpful.
Yeah, well, thank you for that glowing introduction. Hopefully, I can live up to some of the hype there. But I work for the Memoria Press Online Academy, the principal of the Online Academy, and I also get to teach a few classes. So it's kind of the perfect job.
That's awesome. And then, as I mentioned on our last episode, you also are the Greek specialist. Greek is a love of yours. You were even reading Greek books to your infant child. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're doing a few. She's 4 months, so
Yep.
she's developing her Greek skills on a slow basis, but we're getting there with her. But yeah, just a perfect situation. Get to work in an education environment, but also get to continue to do something I love, like Greek as well. So I've landed in a perfect spot.
So this first episode is going to be an overview of definitions. A lot of the reason that we have jobs is because in our culture, in education broadly in America, definitions have slid. There is an imprecision in definitions. There is confusion about what education is, what it should be for, how to do it. And people who came before us had started to make headway in this, and they brought us along and taught us a lot of what they knew about how these words have precise definitions that we can recover and help to bring education to future generations. And so one of the most important concepts is the liberal arts.
Yeah, and the liberal arts, it's kind of a confused topic today, right? Like the word, that phrase, the liberal arts is kind of bandied about.
Right.
We went to a liberal arts college.
Yeah, true.
And your major is English?
That's right. Yeah, it's a funny story. Basically, I had always thought I was going to be a pastor. Mm-hmm. I was heading towards ministry. And I started as biblical studies at this liberal arts college. And really, it was vocational training. I learned about leading music and the specifics of counseling, all good things that I would then do again when I went to seminary. So about 2 years in, I had a literature class with this guy named Mr. Nathan Hofsteller. Shout out Mr. Hofsteller if you ever listen to this. Just an amazing man who opened my eyes to the beauty and the profundity of literature and what it teaches us about being human. And at the time, I thought I was making a movement towards the liberal arts.
Right.
Since then, I've grown. You had a similar path, right?
Yeah. So I started off, in the freshman year saying, I think I maybe would like to consider going into ministry. But then quickly, like that first year said, the humanities is going to be the route for me. And so, got a degree in humanities. I did keep the Greek minor, so we had all of our Greek classes together up until our last year, I think. And I remember every Greek class for us, for every single semester of our college, was like at 7:00 in the morning.
That's right.
As I recall.
Yeah.
But you raise a good point. At a liberal arts school, we often think of like the English department as like the liberal arts, right? Like, if you're going to major in literature and writing, then that's the liberal arts. And so that kind of raises a definitional question, I would say.
That's right.
About the liberal arts.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Let's just start with liberal arts. What are they?
Right. So traditionally, there's the seven liberal arts, right? This is the Trivium, three, and the Quadrivium, four, right? So there's three and four, and so for the Trivium, you have grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and then for the Quadrivium, you have arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy,
Yeah.
right? And so I guess we'll spend, a couple of weeks, answering that question, though what those exactly are. But in terms of what they are, it's those seven skills, those seven arts.
Yeah, so talk to me too about why we use this word liberal arts, right? So, I mean, I think this kind of
Yeah.
gets at what you were pointing out with the irony that I thought I was getting a liberal arts degree when I studied English.
Right, right. Well, and it's helpful to, begin to make a few distinctions. And before you can really kind of define what these terms are, they have to be placed into a context. And so at the broadest level, in the context of education, there's really two kind of domains that that constitute an education, right? You have the arts and you have the sciences.
Which is funny because we use those words now to talk about arts, refer to basically music, drama, and any kind of visual art.
Yes.
And science basically exclusively refers to what they used to call natural philosophy.
Yeah, you're absolutely
that's
right.
that's
yeah,
not correct
so we have to
anymore.
break these words down a little bit, right? Because they have a historical meaning, and that's kind of began to define these, right? So, you're right. Like when we think about art and the arts, we tend to think about either the end product for an artist, right? A painter develops, he makes art, or we tend to think about the craft of the artist, like he works on his art. He's good at his art, right?
Right.
Or he's, so he makes art and he's good at his art. But when we use the word art from the Latin ars, which means skill, we're referring more to the definition of art in the phrase that's kind of captured in the phrase, the art of conversation. So in the phrase, the art of conversation, we're not referring to like the end product of something, of an artist's productive activity. We're not really talking about the fact that he's doing it. We're talking about a skill, the skill of conversation.
Yeah.
So in that clause, the art of conversation, what we have is some residual definition of what the true Latin word is, which means skill, the skill or the art of conversation. So, and as a skill, right, then that's something that's developed. So it's helpful to kind of go back and look at, okay, we use the word art, but the Latin word really does mean skill. And so that's one piece of what an education, in that broader context, what an education is, arts. The second thing to make a distinction about is, what do we mean by science? So when I say that education has two broad domains, the arts and the sciences, I don't mean kind of the code analytical sciences like biology, anatomy, chemistry. What I mean is comes from the Greek word scientia, right? Which is just kind of broadly refers to domains of knowledge. So you can have the human sciences, called the humanities,
Right.
and this is where you got your degree, right? It's in English and in literature, which is one of the human sciences. It's one of the moral sciences. The other sciences that would go in that category would be like, so obviously literature, but philosophy, and history, right? That's exactly right. So those are the three human sciences. But then you have these others, domains of knowledge as well, that would encapsulate the other sciences like chemistry, biology, right?
Right.
Natural sciences, where you're studying the natural world. So, if again going back to that broad context, arts, which are the liberal arts, and then and more than that, but essentially the liberal arts and then the sciences, and an education should have those two pieces, right? It should have skills and knowledge. And that knowledge is going to encapsulate everything that there is that you could know, right? About history, philosophy, anatomy, chemistry.
Even theology.
Theology as one of the moral sciences as well. So there's a lot can be said about the sciences. And when most people think about education, they tend to just think about the sciences.
Yeah.
and those domains of knowledge that because there's just so much there, and in our understanding of the natural world it has grown exponentially since the Enlightenment, and so when we think about an education today, we tend to think exclusively in terms of the impartation of knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's where, going back to the liberal arts is
what you're saying has so many implications for how we approach the task of education. And we say it all the time here that one of the biggest problems, and there are many, but one of the biggest problems in the modern educational movement is this hyper specification and focus on the natural sciences, which de-emphasizes the importance of content, and the loss of arts as skills. That these skills are the ability to acquire knowledge that are in the sciences. And that the breakdown of definition has such a practical ramification that you see in the educational curriculums that most people use.
Yeah, and this is why it's important again to make another distinction. If these are the two broad domains of education, the arts and the sciences, well, which ones are more important? Well, in one sense, they're both central, right, to an education. But in another sense, you're probably not going to remember all of the things you learned about chemistry, or unless you go into that field. You're probably not going to remember all the things you learned about medieval history. You might not even remember how to pronounce all the Greek, famous Greeks names, like the Themistocles, Demosthenes. Those are going to slip away. But what hopefully won't slip away are these skills, these tools for thinking. And so that's why, yes, both are vitally important to an education, especially classical education. A classical education is content heavy.
Right.
But one of the advantages of a classical education is that it also recognizes the longevity and really the long-term importance of the liberal arts as tools that teach us not only what to think, but how to think. Yeah. Right. And so these skills are, and I think we'll continue to define them a little bit, but they're vitally important for just your ability to, even as you're going to forget things that you learned in school, but when you have the skills, the liberal arts, then you'll always be able to reacquire knowledge, right? You'll always be able to dig further because you know how to think well.
That's a great point. And like you said, the point of this series is we're going to go through each of these arts, and we're going to talk about them and understand how they contribute to the educational process. But let's do a little bit more fine-tuning in our definitions.
Yeah.
There's a movement in classical education to define, especially the trivium, slightly differently than perhaps how you're talking about it today. And there's some merit to it. Right. But we also have some critiques. So can you talk a little bit about Dorothy Sayer's model of the trivium, her developmental model, and what you think of it and how helpful is it for education today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a lot of, I think, helpful, I think what she has to say is helpful in the sense that, the model there is kind of a developmental model that we're at the younger years, you're learning grammar, and then at the that's like grade school, and then middle school you're learning it's kind of the logic stage, right? So you're beginning to do more abstract thinking, and then in the high school years that's really the rhetoric stage where you're learning to make arguments, you're learning to be persuasive, things like that. And in one sense, like that does make a lot of sense. Kids at an early age probably do need to be large on grammar and small on rhetoric.
Right.
Right. And so that sort of paradigm is helpful, but it might also hide the fact that grammar can exist at all levels. Right. Grammar grammar and logic are skills that are going to be just as present in a different way. Or just as present like in your senior year of high school as it is in your third grade year of grammar school, but it's going to be present in a different way.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I thought that's why you're teaching Sylvia, your infant, Greek grammar right now, is because you didn't know if she'd be able to learn it later.
Well, and that's not the case. Ideally, yes, she's learning hard linguistic grammar right now, but grammar also and I think we'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but grammar also constitutes just putting a name, putting a label to things out in the world. And so, if you're going to learn a new discipline in your junior, senior year, like say you're going to start moving into the study of ethics, then there's a whole grammar behind the study of ethics,
Right.
deontology, virtue, excellence, arete, eudaimonia, right? So all these are, Greek concepts or modern concepts. So there's a grammar to be learned to, something like the study of ethics. Just stepping back to answer the question, there is some help to seeing just acknowledging the basic fact that kids at an earlier age, they're not really thinking, they're still developing those foundational skills that are going to prepare them to think, logically. They're going to prepare them to begin to make distinctions. And then they're certainly still preparing to be able to make persuasive arguments.
Right.
We don't expect the same level of rhetoric from a third grader that we do, a junior in high school. But we do expect a third grader to begin to use language to make a point.
Right.
And so that's why even a third grader, there's some expectation that rhetoric is going to be involved in communication. So I want to say both there's a positive to that sort of paradigm, but then also maybe that there's a risk in that paradigm hiding the fact that these things can exist at multiple levels.
And tell me if you agree with this, but I think another part of the critique with Dorothy Sayer's model is that when she was making this case, she wasn't necessarily making a historical argument. She seems to be making a practical, observational argument about the nature of kids. They memorize a lot when they're little, and they become more articulate when they're older.
Yeah.
But what we have attempted to do here, following Martin and Cheryl Lowe and others who have come before us, is try to recover a historical perspective on education. These definitions have slid, and historically they did not use these terms to denote purely developmental stages. And so it's helpful in our education to learn from the wisdom of the ancients. And is that your observation as well?
Yeah, I think that in our in the last century we've become more sensitive to the fact that in terms of a child's development, they learn things at different levels at different times, and they acquire the ability to think in different ways as they get older. And so I do think that Dorothy Sayers was stepped into that and said, hey, there is some truth to this sort of this fact that kids at a young age can just absorb a lot. And so, I think there was as our understanding of human psychology was growing, then there was a helpful nod to that with Dorothy Sayers. But then as we continue on and say, yes, there's some good there, let's embrace that, but then let's try to define historically what these terms have meant, then we're able to see that, the liberal arts have their tentacles in students from the earliest ages through today. Through us right now.
Right.
Hopefully we're still growing in our grammar and logic and rhetoric. Right. And this, so there are a lot more can be said there.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, I returning to these historic definitions that really began with Plato, and helps us see how these skills are alive and active for an education beginning in kindergarten, or in the case of my little girl, 4 months, and really continues to to the end of life.
So let me ask you to give your perspective from inside the school, Memoria Press Online Academy, which has a full and thriving curriculum itself. Your observation on the role that the liberal arts have in curriculum itself. We talked in our last episode about moral philosophy and how important it was that the educational process be aimed at growing up students to be virtuous. We want students to be virtuous. We want them to fear the Lord as a result of our education. But the liberal arts has a special place, right? Because it is the skill training and the content transformative bedrock of our education. How have you seen that play out with the Memoria Press Online Academy, the way that you guys are offering classes, the way that you guys are telling your teachers how to teach, so on?
Yeah. So, a couple things, like in the context, there are more than just the liberal arts in an education, right? There are in an education, there would also probably be the manual arts. The manual arts would be like carpentry or sewing or cooking, right? These are arts that produce something. And in a classical school, we're not teaching those arts.
Right.
And not that those arts aren't important. I mean, you need good, virtuous plumbers and you need good, virtuous carpenters and seamstresses, right? So there is a kind of, in terms of education, a higher value that's placed on, for the purposes of education, the liberal arts. And in a school setting, right? I mean, think of just because I'm teaching moral philosophy right now, I've been thinking about it a lot. I don't want to exhaust everyone with illustrations from that, but it might be helpful just to realize and begin to evaluate every class to the extent that it's going to be grammar heavy, logic heavy, or rhetoric heavy, right? In a literature class, the upper level literature class, it might be really heavy on rhetoric. You might be asking your students to make and write persuasive essays about a particular point in a novel. So they might be heavy on rhetoric. But in a class like moral philosophy, you're going to have to learn definitions and the names for things. So it might be initially heavy on grammar, but then by the end of a moral philosophy class, then hopefully it'll kind of the capstone will be a sort of rhetoric time where we can make persuasive arguments with one another about the nature of ethics today, or the nature of how they should be. Now, there's also even in that class, you can kind of see a development at the very beginning of a class. You're defining terms, you're trying to clearly point at things in the world and define them for what they are. And then there's a logic stage probably in a moral philosophy class where you're beginning to talk about what things make sense, what moral arguments make sense, what moral arguments don't make sense, why do they not make sense, how do they syllogistically break down. And then by the end, hopefully in a class like that, you've acquired the definitions and the definitional knowledge, and you've been able to make distinctions so that now you can make a persuasive argument about this is what moral philosophy should be today. And that's what I had all my students do. That's their final essay, is talking about moral philosophy today. It's either making an argument that it's all wrong, or making an argument that we need to return a more positive argument. We need to return to Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or something like that. And some classes are going to do that, but I think moral philosophy is a great example of that's kind of touching on all three. And probably every class is going to have some element of that. But some classes are going to emphasize pretty heavily on one or the other. Like the study of Latin. I mean, it's not really until you're reading texts where, the logic and rhetoric are kind of coming in. Especially from like third grade on, in these younger years, you're pretty much just studying grammar. You're learning vocabulary, you're learning grammar forms, seeing how sentences are fit together so that you can make sentences. And at the end of the day, I mean, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, that is the curriculum. I mean, we offer classes in grammar, we have we teach traditional logic, and we teach rhetoric. We teach students how to make good arguments, right? So we have entire classes that are dedicated to these, to these skills,
right?
And that's been the case since the Greeks and the Romans.
It's certainly more than that, but it can never be less than those disciplines. So that was our first episode, defining terms, giving people a sense of what is the liberal arts. We took a broad view. Going forward, we are going to define each of them. We're going to talk a little bit about them, how they show up in curriculum, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks.